The morning air carried the faint scent of pine and dew, and yet, despite the serenity of the cabin tucked into the rolling hills of the county, a tension lingered, palpable, suffocating, and relentless. Karen from the Ho had made it abundantly clear that she believed authority could bend reality. She had arrived yesterday, her clipboard clutched like a weapon, her sharp heels clicking across the gravel, her voice oscillating between indignation and fury. "You need to leave. You are in violation," she had shouted, her finger stabbing the air as though its trajectory could compel compliance. I had met her gaze steadily, knowing with absolute certainty that the law was firmly on my side. Not just the cabin, but the entire land surrounding it. Every parcel, every boundary, every record confirmed my unassailable ownership. Yet Karen didn't see law. She saw power, entitlement, the illusion that persistence could substitute authority. She did not understand the meticulous research I had undertaken, the county records that detailed decades of acquisition, or the subtle yet profound principle that legality cannot be overwritten by ego. When she called 911 that morning, insisting that I vacate immediately, I remained composed. The operator, polite but evidently skeptical, asked for clarification. I explained the situation succinctly, emphasizing ownership, legal precedent, and the absurdity of her claim. The line went silent for a moment. Then the dispatcher acknowledged the details, politely advising Karen to consider the legality of her demands. It wasn't the first confrontation, nor would it be the last. Karen's obsession was evident, her fixation on control absolute. She thrived on drama, on spectacle, on the notion that her will could shape the behavior of neighbors. And yet, in her obsession, she revealed a pattern, a series of predictable behaviors that, when carefully documented, could be anticipated, neutralized, and ultimately rendered powerless. From the cabin, I watched her retreat momentarily, regrouping, plotting her next move. Her eyes scanned the property, fingers tapping the clipboard with nervous energy, as though each strike could rewrite history. I returned indoors, retrieved my own records, and began cataloging the events with meticulous precision. Photographs, timestamps, notes on tone, gesture, and intent each became a fragment of evidence, a building block in the architecture of defense. Neighbors began to notice. Some approached cautiously, others with curiosity, and a few with thinly veiled support for Karen. The dynamics of community pressure were subtle yet potent. Perception, after all, can be manipulated as easily as authority can be misapplied. Yet my response remained measured, deliberate, and patient. Every interaction was approached with strategic intent, ensuring that emotional provocation did not override legal reality. Karen's tactics evolved with time. It began with overt confrontation, escalated to letters slipped under doors and threatening correspondence, and soon became psychological warfare. She would linger at the edges of the property, her car parked just out of reach, surveillance intentional and persistent. Stones were arranged along paths, small but deliberate markers of presence, an almost subliminal assertion of dominion. At first glance, these actions seemed innocuous, easily dismissed as coincidence or coincidence amplified by paranoia. But the deliberate repetition, the precision of placement, and the context left little room for doubt. Karen was attempting to unsettle, to provoke, to manipulate perception. I documented every instance, not with emotion, but with analytical clarity. Each act, each gesture, each note was recorded, photographed, and cataloged. Patterns emerged. Predictability became an asset. Her obsession, while formidable in effort, revealed limits when observed systematically. Each day, as I walked the perimeter, checked cameras, and reviewed correspondence, I became increasingly aware of the nature of her campaign. It was less about legal enforcement and more about psychological dominance. She sought control where none could be legitimately exercised, relying on spectacle, intimidation, and social pressure to achieve her ends. Yet her obsession revealed her vulnerability. Persistence without precision can be anticipated. Ego without foundation can be counted. Authority without legality is fragile. These principles guided my response. Each confrontation, whether direct or symbolic, was met with evidence, calm explanation, and meticulous recording. Emotional escalation was avoided, patience maintained, and the larger strategic picture preserved. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the towering pines, I encountered Karen on the edge of the property again. She approached with deliberate purpose, clipboard in hand, a faint smirk suggesting triumph. "Do you realize the seriousness of your noncompliance?" she demanded, voice raised to carry across the clearing. "You are undermining the the neighborhood, and community standards." I met her gaze steadily. "Compliance is a matter of legality, not perception," I said calmly. "Your efforts, though persistent, cannot supersede documented ownership. Every claim you make, every threat you issue, is circumscribed by law. I am acting fully within my rights, and your actions cannot alter reality." Her eyes narrowed, lips pressed into a line of frustration. She gestured wildly, attempting to punctuate her authority, yet her theatrics faltered against calm rationality. It was a familiar pattern. Ego asserting itself against immutable facts, persistence pitted against preparation. The conflict extended beyond the immediate confrontation. Notes began appearing on the cabin's doorstep, subtly threatening yet professionally phrased. Vehicles were observed at the perimeter at odd hours, lingering without purpose other than surveillance. Rumors were seeded among neighbors, careful whispers designed to create doubt, fear, or social pressure. Each act was deliberate, and each required measured response. I developed a routine. Every morning began with a thorough check of the property cameras and surroundings. Every note, every letter, every interaction was logged. Legal counsel was consulted regularly, not reactively but strategically, ensuring that every potential escalation was addressed preemptively. Psychological observations were made. Patterns of obsession, attempts at intimidation, and reliance on social influence were all noted and analyzed. Knowledge became both shield and weapon, neutralizing the impact of Karen's relentless fixation. Despite months of conflict, the underlying tension remained. The cabin, once a place of peace and retreat, had become a stage for a complex interplay of law, psychology, and human ego. Each day demanded vigilance, patience, and precision. Yet the very nature of this confrontation offered insights. The predictable patterns of obsession, the limitations of authority without law, and the enduring value of preparation, documentation, and calm composure. One particularly tense day, Karen attempted to orchestrate a neighborhood assembly at the periphery of my property. She framed it as an urgent review of compliance, a strategic maneuver designed to create social pressure and compel acquiescence. I observed from a safe distance, documenting attendance, statements, and behavior. The gathering, though intended to intimidate, revealed more about her than me, her obsession, her reliance on perception, and the fragility of authority ungrounded in law. Over time, the conflict became a study in human behavior. Each act of provocation revealed strategy, compulsion, and psychological motivation. Each response required foresight, preparation, and strategic calm. The forest, the lake, and the cabin became silent witnesses to the drama, a theater in which law and rationality were tested against ego and obsession. Winter's approach brought with it reflection. The days shortened, the air crisp, and the forest took on a serene, almost indifferent quality. Yet the conflict persisted, subtle, patient, and relentless. Karen's obsession, though diminished in overt theatrics, continued in nuanced forms. Every glance, every note, every subtle intrusion was a reminder that vigilance was paramount, and that preparation, composure, and knowledge remained the ultimate defenses. In these months of confrontation, the cabin had transformed. It was no longer merely a home. It had become a strategic hub, a place where observation, documentation, and legal clarity converged. Every interaction, every provocation, and every escalation was an opportunity to study human behavior, assert rights, and maintain authority through preparation rather than aggression. Karen's campaign, for all its intensity, revealed fundamental truths. Persistence alone cannot overcome legality, theatrics cannot supplant preparation, and obsession, however relentless, can be anticipated and neutralized. The narrative of confrontation was no longer chaotic, it had become structured, predictable, and manageable. As dusk settled over the forest, I reviewed the day's documentation. Each note, photograph, and recorded encounter was cataloged. Each subtle provocation was analyzed. Each interaction reinforced a larger principle, that in conflicts over property, authority, and ego, knowledge, preparation, and composure are the ultimate shields. And so, the first chapter of this saga concluded, not with resolution, but with a foundation. The cabin remained secure. Ownership was affirmed. Karen's obsession continued, but its impact was mitigated. The forest, indifferent yet ever-present, bore silent witness to a struggle defined not by volume or fury, but by strategic calm, meticulous documentation, and unwavering adherence to principle. The days that followed were marked by a subtle, insidious escalation. Karen's obsession had evolved beyond overt confrontation. Her tactics became quieter, more persistent, more strategic. It was no longer enough to simply demand compliance or wave a clipboard in my face. Now, she attempted to manipulate perception, to create an atmosphere of surveillance and uncertainty. Each morning, as I stepped onto the porch of the cabin, I noticed small anomalies, stones arranged with precision along the path, the faint glint of a car parked at the edge of the forest, and subtle footprints that did not belong to any neighbor or passerby. Each of these acts, while individually insignificant, formed a mosaic of intimidation that was unmistakable when viewed collectively. I documented everything. Each mark, each vehicle, each note slipped beneath the door was photographed, time-stamped, and cataloged. The pattern was emerging clearly. Karen relied on ritualized behaviors to assert control. She believed that consistency in observation could translate into authority, that repetition could intimidate, and that the mere presence of surveillance could undermine my resolve. Yet, she underestimated one fundamental truth. Predictability is a weapon when studied carefully, and every obsessive pattern has a rhythm, a cadence, a flaw. Neighbors began to take notice. Some approached me cautiously, whispering rumors they had heard or subtle concerns they felt compelled to share. Others remained aloof, choosing distance over involvement. Still others, inevitably, acted as informal emissaries of Karen's influence, repeating her claims, amplifying her narrative, and attempting to shape community perception. Each interaction was a microcosm of the larger conflict, a test of composure, a challenge to clarity, and an opportunity to assert truth against misinformation. Karen's letters intensified. They were no longer simple warnings or reminders of alleged infractions. They became detailed dossiers, complete with photographs, selective excerpts from bylaws, and emotionally charged language designed to provoke. Her handwriting was precise, her tone assertive, each sentence crafted to convey authority, urgency, and moral superiority. Yet, the content, while elaborate, was legally hollow. Each claim she made was refuted by documented ownership, county records, and clear precedents. I responded to every communication systematically, creating a layered defense of clarity and law that slowly neutralized the potency of her threats. One afternoon, I discovered a new tactic. Karen had enlisted the cooperation of a neighbor to act as an observer, someone who could report on my behavior and relay perceived violations back to her. This was subtle, almost imperceptible in execution, but it revealed a key insight into her methodology. Karen's power did not lie solely in confrontation. It relied on social manipulation, the orchestration of perception, and the amplification of minor acts into purported evidence of wrongdoing. Understanding this allowed me to anticipate her moves and maintain control over the narrative. In response, I strengthened my own defenses. Cameras were adjusted, documentation routines refined, and communication strategies carefully calibrated. Every potential point of observation was accounted for, every interaction was logged, and every subtle intrusion became a piece of evidence rather than a source of anxiety. Karen's obsession, while relentless, became predictable, and predictability is the foundation of strategy. The psychological dimension of the conflict deepened. Karen began to arrive at the property under the guise of casual visits, blending her surveillance with attempts at casual conversation. Her tone suggested concern. Her words were carefully neutral, but the subtext was unmistakable. She was testing boundaries, gauging reactions, and attempting to provoke subtle responses that could be reported or documented. Each encounter was a delicate balance, acknowledging her presence without conceding authority, responding calmly without escalation, maintaining composure without appearing indifferent. This required rigorous mental discipline. Every gesture, every word, every glance was weighed against potential outcomes. I rehearsed interactions, anticipated provocations, and refined responses to ensure that emotion never compromised strategy. The forest around the cabin, once a place of respite, had become both shield and witness, offering a vantage point from which observation, preparation, and anticipation could be executed flawlessly. As the weeks progressed, Karen escalated further. She began to organize informal neighborhood gatherings, ostensibly for social reasons, but the intent was clear: to create pressure, influence perception, and assert moral authority. I attended these gatherings with strategic intent, observing interactions, noting reactions, and preparing measured responses. Her supporters, emboldened by her theatrics, attempted subtle intimidation, veiled comments, pointed questions, and insinuations meant to provoke doubt or elicit defensive responses. Yet every effort was carefully neutralized through composure, clarity, and the calm presentation of facts. One evening, Karen's persistence reached a new peak. She appeared at the cabin's edge during the fading light of dusk, her presence almost cinematic in its precision. The clipboard was out, notes in hand, and her demeanor conveyed a mixture of authority, frustration, and obsession. "You continue to defy the community," she stated sharply. "Your actions are unacceptable and cannot be ignored." I stepped forward, calm and deliberate, and met her gaze. "Compliance is not optional where law is clear. Every assertion you make, every claim you raise, is circumscribed by documentation and ownership records. Your persistence does not alter the facts of reality." For a moment, she faltered. The theatrical flourish, the rehearsed indignation, all seemed diminished by the unwavering clarity of truth. Her frustration, subtle yet palpable, was a reminder of the limits of authority divorced from law. Ego, persistence, and perception alone could not compel compliance. Karen's next move was strategic, if predictable. She attempted to rally another neighbor to her cause, presenting her narrative as a community concern. The neighbor, hesitant, approached me cautiously, seeking clarification. I presented the facts clearly, calmly, and without judgment: ownership records, legal precedents, and the documented history of the property. The neighbor nodded subtly, realizing the difference between spectacle and truth. Karen's influence waned in the face of clarity, her carefully constructed narrative undermined by documentation, preparation, and patience. Despite this, Karen's obsession did not abate. Surveillance continued, notes persisted, and subtle provocations remained. Yet her methods were now predictable, her efforts less effective, and her influence diminished. Each day became a strategic exercise: observation, documentation, preparation, and measured response. The cabin had transformed into a command center of resilience, the forest a silent ally, and the lake a mirror of clarity amid human turbulence. The social dynamics of the conflict provided additional insight. Observing neighbors, noting allegiances, and analyzing perception became integral to maintaining control. Karen's reliance on rumor, implication, and social pressure highlighted the fragility of authority based solely on theatrics. Truth, documentation, and law proved resilient, immune to distortion, and ultimately more persuasive than emotion or persistence. By the time autumn gave way to winter, the cumulative effect of months of confrontation became evident. Karen's efforts, while persistent, were largely neutralized. Her attempts at intimidation were predictable, her social manipulations increasingly transparent, and her theatrical flourishes ineffective against calm, deliberate strategy. The cabin remained secure, ownership undisputed, and the larger narrative controlled through preparation, observation, and clarity of intent. One particularly memorable encounter occurred on a cold, gray afternoon. Karen arrived unannounced, clipboard in hand, attempting to orchestrate a neighborhood review at the property line. Her tone was confident, her gestures deliberate, yet her underlying obsession betrayed vulnerability. I approached, documented the interaction, and presented legal records with clarity, addressing every claim she made. The assembly of neighbors, initially inclined to support her, became silent observers, witnessing the disparity between perception and reality. Karen's theatrics were rendered ineffective by the weight of evidence, preparation, and strategic composure. As dusk fell, the forest surrounding the cabin appeared tranquil, indifferent to the human drama at its edge. The lake mirrored the fading light, a calm contrast to the turbulence of confrontation. I reflected on the lessons of the months. Persistence alone cannot overcome law. Theatrics cannot substitute for preparation, and obsession, however relentless, is predictable and manageable when studied systematically. Karen's obsession, though relentless, had become increasingly ineffective. Each day reinforced the principles of strategic response, meticulous documentation, and unwavering composure. The conflict, while ongoing, was no longer chaotic. It had become structured, predictable, and navigable. The cabin, once merely a home, had transformed into a sanctuary of strategy, observation, and resilience. Winter had fully set in, draping the forest and cabin in a thick, glistening blanket of snow. The serene landscape with frozen lake edges and snow-laden pine trees contrasted sharply with the simmering tension that lingered around the property. Karen, undeterred by prior setbacks, escalated her efforts. She realized that subtle surveillance and psychological intimidation had been partially neutralized, so she pivoted toward legal maneuvers and social influence, attempting to marshal both to compel compliance. One chilly morning, a letter arrived, stamped formally, indicating an HOA-led neighborhood council review of compliance with community standards. Karen's signature dominated the page, her words carefully chosen to convey authority, urgency, and moral supremacy. The missive was crafted to intimidate neighbors as well as myself, subtly suggesting consensus against my perceived noncompliance. Yet beneath the polished tone and legalistic veneer, the document was hollow. Ownership records and county law clearly overrode HOA bylaws where jurisdiction was absent, a fact she seemed unable or unwilling to comprehend. Preparing for the assembly required meticulous planning. I reviewed all legal documentation, county records, and prior correspondence, creating a comprehensive portfolio of evidence. Each potential point of challenge, every possible objection, was anticipated and counted. Psychological preparation was equally important. Karen's approach relied heavily on spectacle, social pressure, and the assumption that I would react emotionally. By maintaining composure, I could neutralize her most potent strategies before they gained traction. The day of the council review arrived with biting wind and gray skies, a natural reflection of the tension that permeated the gathering. Karen arrived first, exuding confidence, clipboard in hand, rehearsed gestures, and deliberate expressions designed to convey authority. Neighbors trickled in, some out of curiosity, others out of loyalty, and a few, perhaps, from a desire to witness the unfolding drama. As I entered the gathering, I observed each participant carefully, noting their expressions, body language, and likely biases. Understanding social dynamics was as critical as legal preparation. Karen opened the session with practiced flair, outlining alleged violations, emphasizing community standards, and subtly implying that noncompliance could result in broader repercussions. Her delivery was theatrical. Gestures punctuated statements, inflections highlighted urgency, and expressions conveyed moral superiority. Yet, beneath the performance, the argument lacked substance. Every alleged violation could be refuted with legal documentation, ownership records, and precedent, When she concluded her presentation, a hush fell over the room. Neighbors exchanged glances, some uncertain, others intrigued. I stood, portfolio in hand, and began systematically dismantling each claim. Legal records were referenced, county statutes cited, and prior documentation presented with clarity. Each counterpoint was articulated calmly, without emotional inflection, allowing the evidence to speak louder than rhetoric. Karen's initial composure faltered. The deliberate theatricality that had served as her primary tool now clashed with irrefutable fact. She attempted to interject, to assert social pressure, but the audience, guided by clarity and evidence, became increasingly attentive to the truth. Her allies, those who had relied on perception and rumor, hesitated, recognizing the disparity between spectacle and reality. As the session progressed, the dynamics shifted subtly but unmistakably. Karen's insistence on authority became transparent, her reliance on theatrics exposed. Each objection she raised was met not with anger, but with precise documentation, calm explanation, and measured observation. The audience responded not to her voice, but to the clarity of evidence, the weight of documentation, and the deliberate, unwavering confidence of preparation. Throughout the gathering, I maintained a deliberate posture, attentive but composed, assertive yet unreactive, measured but resolute. Each gesture was calculated, each word carefully chosen to neutralize provocation and reinforce authority grounded in legality. The psychological tension was palpable. Karen's attempts to manipulate perception and social consensus were systematically undermined by transparency, preparation, and rationality. After nearly 2 hours of meticulous review, the assembly concluded. Karen remained, her composure partially intact but visibly strained. Her repeated attempts at social influence, intimidation, and moral posturing had been rendered largely ineffective. The neighbors, having observed the contrast between spectacle and evidence, departed with a renewed understanding of reality. Karen's campaign, while relentless, had met its first significant obstacle: transparency and truth. Yet the confrontation did not end with that session. Karen, persistent as ever, continued her campaign through informal channels, subtle provocations, and social maneuvering. She sought to influence perception outside formal assemblies, planting suggestions and veiled warnings among neighbors, attempting to frame my actions as disruptive or non-compliant. These subtle intrusions required ongoing vigilance. I observed, documented, and anticipated each move, gradually constructing a detailed psychological map of her behavior, her motivations, and her predictable responses. The psychological warfare extended beyond neighbors and meetings. Notes continued to appear beneath the cabin door, vehicles were observed at odd hours, and minor disturbances were orchestrated to provoke response. Yet every act was counted with preparation and observation. Each subtle provocation was transformed from a source of stress into a data point, a clue, and an opportunity to refine strategy. Karen's obsession, while formidable, revealed limitations when analyzed systematically. As weeks passed, her tactics evolved further. She attempted to leverage local media and social platforms, framing her narrative as a broader community concern. This amplified her perceived influence, but the legal foundation of my property remained unshakable. Every claim was carefully counted, every statement analyzed, and each attempt at social manipulation neutralized. The narrative, once dominated by her theatrics, became increasingly balanced through documentation, clarity, and public transparency. Despite months of escalation, the cabin remained secure. Ownership was undisputed, authority based on law unchallenged, and the broader environment increasingly aware of the disparity between Karen's perception of control and the reality of legal dominance. Her obsession, though persistent, began to manifest fatigue. The energy required to maintain constant surveillance, manipulation, and intimidation revealed human limitations when confronted with unwavering composure and preparation. One evening, as snowflakes drifted across the frozen lake, Karen appeared again at the edge of the property, her signature glare tempered by frustration. "You continue to defy community standards," she said, her voice quieter but no less intense. "This behavior cannot continue indefinitely," I responded with calm precision. "Behavior is measured against law and fact, not perception or social expectation. Every assertion you make has been documented, reviewed, and addressed. Persistence alone cannot override documented ownership or legal precedent." Her hands trembled slightly, and for a fleeting moment, her confident veneer cracked. It was a subtle but profound confirmation. Obsession, however relentless, has limits when confronted with preparation, evidence, and strategic composure. As winter deepened, the forest seemed to envelop the cabin in protective quiet. The lake reflected pale skies, and the landscape, indifferent to human drama, bore silent witness to the ongoing struggle. Each day reinforced critical lessons. Authority ungrounded in law is fragile. Social manipulation is ineffective against transparency, and persistence without foundation is ultimately powerless. Karen's final maneuvers during this period were both subtle and telling. She attempted to engage additional neighbors in casual observation, framing inquiries as concern or curiosity, yet the pattern was unmistakable. She sought to amplify perception, to extend influence, and to provoke response. Every effort was cataloged, analyzed, and neutralized. Her obsession had become a predictable rhythm, and predictability is the cornerstone of strategy. By the close of this chapter, the conflict had transformed. What began as overt confrontation had evolved into complex psychological warfare, neighborhood manipulation, and subtle legal maneuvering. The cabin, once merely a retreat, had become a bastion of observation, preparation, and resilience. Each provocation, each subtle intrusion, each attempt at social influence was systematically neutralized through documentation, composure, and strategic clarity. Karen's obsession remained, but its effectiveness had diminished. The narrative, once dominated by intimidation, now reflected the power of preparation, law, and composure over spectacle, persistence, and ego. The lessons were profound. Knowledge, anticipation, and patience can transform even relentless obsession into manageable and ultimately predictable challenges. Winter had reached its zenith. Snow blanketed the forest, and the frozen lake reflected a pale, unbroken sky. The cabin stood firm amidst the serene landscape, seemingly untouched by the months of relentless tension. Yet, beneath this tranquility, the final chapter of confrontation was quietly preparing itself. Karen's obsession, though diminished by prior setbacks, had not yet surrendered. She had escalated her tactics one last time, combining legal threats, social manipulation, and overt surveillance, as if determined to force a resolution through sheer persistence. One morning, the distant hum of a vehicle alerted me to her arrival. Karen's signature glare cut through the winter haze, her clipboard clutched tightly, papers fluttering in the crisp air. She had enlisted additional hall members, likely intending to stage a dramatic showdown, a performance designed to pressure me into submission. But I had prepared meticulously. Months of documentation, legal verification, and observation had transformed the cabin into a command center of resilience. As she approached, I stepped onto the porch deliberately, hands visible, posture calm yet assertive. "Good morning," I said evenly. "I assume you are aware that all prior claims regarding this property have been resolved according to county records and legal documentation." Her lips tightened, a subtle indication of frustration, but she did not retreat. Instead, she gestured at the assembled home members. "Community standards must be respected. You are in violation, and refusing compliance is unacceptable." I maintained composure. Community standards, while important, cannot supersede law. Ownership, documentation, and legal precedent define compliance, and each has been addressed transparently. The home members shifted uneasily. Some nodded subtly, others exchanged glances, realizing that spectacle and assertion could not override facts. Karen's confidence faltered, her frustration evident in the trembling of her hands and the wavering tone of her voice. The theatrics she had relied upon for months were crumbling under the weight of preparation and clarity. She attempted to interject, to regain control through volume and gesture, but each move was anticipated and neutralized. Calmly, I presented the evidence: ownership documents, county records, correspondence logs, and photographs of prior interactions. Each claim she had raised was systematically addressed. Each argument counted, leaving no room for ambiguity or misinterpretation. The subtle power dynamics of the gathering shifted decisively. Karen's authority, long based on perception, social influence, and persistence, was revealed as fragile and performative. The neighbors, witnesses to her efforts and now exposed to irrefutable documentation, began to recognize the disparity between assertion and reality. Her obsession, relentless as it had been, now appeared transparent, almost pitiable in its futility. In a final, desperate effort, she attempted social manipulation, seeking to sway opinion through implication and rumor. She framed minor procedural concerns as community-wide crises, attempting to create doubt or provoke defensive reactions. Yet her tactics were predictable. I addressed each point with calm, precise explanation, relying on facts, law, and thorough documentation. The audience of neighbors, once potential amplifiers of her influence, became observers of a dismantled narrative, witnessing the impotence of ego and persistence when confronted with preparation and clarity. As the confrontation reached its apex, the forest itself seemed to hold its breath. Snow muffled sound, and the frozen lake mirrored a pale, serene sky. The visual contrast between the dramatic tension of human obsession and the indifferent tranquility of nature heightened the moment. Karen's frustration was palpable, her gestures less deliberate, her tone faltering. Months of calculated persistence had been met with calm resilience, and the limits of her strategy were now starkly evident. Eventually, she stepped back, the clipboard lowering slightly, and the final words came with a quiet, almost reluctant acknowledgement. This cannot continue indefinitely. I responded calmly, deliberately. Behavior is measured against law, not perception or ego. Persistence without foundation cannot alter fact, and authority without legality is fragile. A moment of silence followed. The forest, still and indifferent, seemed to echo the truth of that statement. Karen's obsession, relentless and theatrical, had been rendered largely ineffective by patience, preparation, and clarity of intent. The cabin, the property, and the surrounding county were secure, validated not by confrontation, but by law, documentation, and strategic composure. In the days following the final confrontation, Karen's visits became sporadic, then ceased entirely. Subtle provocations, once a constant presence, diminished in frequency and intensity. Her network of social influence weakened as neighbors, now fully aware of the legal realities and the patterns of her obsession, no longer amplified her claims. The drama, once omnipresent, gradually receded, leaving behind a profound sense of resolution. Within the cabin, reflection became the primary occupation. The months of confrontation had been exhausting, intellectually demanding, and psychologically intense. Yet they had also been instructive, revealing fundamental truths about human behavior, social dynamics, and the interplay between law, ego, and obsession. Every act of provocation, every attempt at manipulation, and every escalation had offered insight into the limits of authority divorced from reality, and the enduring power of clarity, preparation, and composure. The cabin itself, once merely a residence, had become a symbol of resilience. Each room, each corridor, each window overlooking the tranquil forest had witnessed confrontation, strategy, and human drama. The forest, ever present, stood as a silent ally, a stabilizing force against the turbulence of obsession and human ego. The frozen lake reflected not only the winter sky, but the calm clarity achieved through patience and deliberate action. Karen's obsession, though persistent, had been reduced to a historical footnote in the narrative of the property. Her efforts, while elaborate and continuous, had been consistently counted, neutralized, and rendered ineffective by methodical preparation, legal clarity, and strategic composure. The narrative of intimidation had been reframed. Spectacle had been replaced by evidence, persistence by predictability, and ego by principle. As winter waned, the lessons of the conflict became increasingly apparent. Preparation, documentation, and strategic observation were not merely defensive tools, they were instruments of empowerment. Patience, composure, and clarity transformed confrontation from a source of stress into a manageable dynamic. Authority, when grounded in law and evidence, proved resilient against even the most determined obsession. The final weeks of winter were marked by quiet observation rather than confrontation. The forest, the frozen lake, and the snow-covered cabin bore witness to the enduring stability achieved through months of strategic action. Karen's attempts at influence, intimidation, and social manipulation had ceased, leaving a landscape both literal and figurative that reflected resolution, clarity, and measured calm. Reflection upon the entire saga revealed profound truths. Conflict, particularly in matters of property, authority, and obsession, is rarely a matter of force or volume. Persistence without legality is impotent. Ego without preparation is fragile. Obsession without strategy is predictable and manageable. These principles, hard-earned through months of engagement, offered enduring guidance for future interactions, both within the county and beyond. The final day of winter arrived with brilliant sunlight reflecting off snow-laden pines. I stepped outside, surveying the cabin, the frozen lake, and the silent forest. Every confrontation, every note, every subtle provocation had been cataloged, addressed, and neutralized. The property was secure, the narrative controlled, and the lessons indelibly learned. The months of obsession, manipulation, and social maneuvering had culminated not in defeat, but in strategic victory, grounded in law, clarity, and composure. As I returned indoors, the cabin felt more than a residence. It was a sanctuary, a command center, a testament to the power of preparation and rational action. Karen's saga, intense and prolonged as it had been, had reached its natural conclusion, leaving behind insights into human behavior, social dynamics, and the enduring efficacy of truth over spectacle. The winter forest, indifferent yet profoundly present, offered its silent acknowledgement. The cabin, the property, and the surrounding county reflected stability and clarity. Karen's obsession had been transformed from a source of stress into a study in predictability, strategy, and psychological insight. And in this quiet, reflective resolution, the ultimate lesson emerged. Confrontation, no matter how relentless, can be navigated successfully through preparation, patience, and unwavering adherence to principle. The story concluded not with dramatics or revenge, but with clarity, calm, and the enduring security of rightful ownership. The cabin stood resilient, the forest enveloped in serene silence, and the lake mirrored the unbroken winter sky. Authority, when grounded in law, had prevailed. Obsession, no matter how persistent, had been neutralized, and the months of conflict became a testament to the enduring power of strategy, preparation, and composure in the face of relentless human ego. The first hints of spring began to stir, softening the harsh edges of winter's frozen landscape. Snow melted slowly along the pine-lined paths, droplets forming on needles like fragile crystals that caught the morning light. The lake, once a mirror of ice, shimmered with reflections of awakening greenery. And yet, as the world around the cabin seemed to breathe a quiet, patient renewal, I felt the weight of the months finally lifting from my shoulders. The relentless tension that Karen had brought into my life, that ceaseless storm of ego and obsession, had finally begun to dissipate. Her visits had ceased entirely. Her notes no longer slipped under the door. Her network of whispered rumors among neighbors now silent. In that stillness, I could finally exhale. The cabin, which had borne witness to confrontation after confrontation, now stood as a monument to resilience. Every corner, every room, held the echoes of months of vigilance. I remembered each moment. The sharp click of her heels on the gravel, the persistent flutter of papers, the anxious glances of neighbors caught in the web of her influence. And yet, alongside these memories, there was an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. Not through force, not through anger, but through patience, preparation, and unwavering adherence to principle. As I walked through the snow-softened paths, I traced the lines of footprints that had crisscrossed the property over the months. Her deliberate steps, my measured responses, the careful choreography of a battle fought not with fists, but with foresight. Each mark told a story of struggle, a subtle reminder that conflict, even when exhausting, can be endured and transformed into wisdom. The stones she had placed along the paths, once silent instruments of intimidation, now seemed almost poetic, markers of human obsession rendered harmless by clarity and composure. The forest seemed to acknowledge the shift. Pine needles glistened with early morning dew, birds returned to the branches, and the air carried a crisp sweetness, the scent of renewal after months of tension. The lake, once frozen and still, reflected the sky in a delicate dance of light and water, mirroring the calm that had settled over the cabin, and, more importantly, within me. I paused at its edge, watching the ripples expand slowly outward, a quiet metaphor for the persistence of truth, for the subtle but unstoppable power of patience. I thought of Karen, her obsession now reduced to memory, her relentless pursuit of control unable to overcome preparation and law. In her persistence, I had seen human fragility laid bare, the way ego clings to illusion, the way obsession blinds judgment, and the way control can be both a tormentor and a prisoner of its own making. There was no satisfaction in her defeat, only a profound recognition of the human struggle between desire and reality, between perception and truth. Sitting by the cabin window that evening, I allowed myself to feel the fullness of relief. The sun set behind the distant hills, casting a golden glow across the snow-dappled landscape, and for the first time in months, I felt the quiet pulse of life returning, not only in nature, but within my own heart. The months of vigilance, of careful documentation, of strategic calm had exacted a toll, yet they had also forged resilience, patience, and a deeper understanding of human behavior. I realized that the ordeal had transformed me, not into someone hardened or bitter, but into someone more observant, more grounded, and profoundly grateful for the enduring stability of law and reason. Neighbors, too, seemed to sense the change. The subtle tension that had hung over the community began to dissipate, replaced by tentative interactions and cautious smiles. Some, who had once whispered rumors, now nodded politely in passing, their understanding of reality gradually aligning with fact rather than perception. There was a quiet restoration of balance, a social recalibration that mirrored the tranquility of the forest and lake. The dynamics of influence and power, once skewed by ego and obsession, had been corrected not through confrontation, but through steadfast clarity and unwavering adherence to principle. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in deep shades of amber and rose, I walked the perimeter of the property one last time. Each tree, each stone, each path bore silent witness to the journey I had endured. I allowed myself a moment of gratitude for the clarity that guided my decisions, for the patience that tempered my responses, and for the unwavering loss that had provided unshakable grounding. There was a profound sense of harmony in knowing that persistence, when untethered from truth, eventually falters, while calm and preparation endure. The cabin itself, once merely a place of retreat, had become a sanctuary of reflection. I sat by the hearth that evening, the soft glow of the fire illuminating the walls lined with memories of the ordeal. Each document, each photograph, each note of recorded interaction was no longer a weapon of defense, but a testament to resilience and foresight. The months of confrontation had left a permanent imprint, not of fear or anxiety, but of wisdom, strategy, and the quiet power of unwavering composure. As night fell and the forest grew still, I allowed myself to consider the human lessons woven into this prolonged conflict. Obsession, no matter how persistent, is ultimately fragile. Authority ungrounded in law is impotent. Ego, relentless as it may be, cannot prevail against clarity, patience, and preparation. These truths, etched deeply into my experience, would guide future challenges, ensuring that no amount of spectacle or intimidation could unsettle the foundation of calm and reason. And yet, the emotional weight of the months remained. There was a lingering ache, a recognition of the intensity of human conflict, and a profound respect for the endurance it demanded. I felt a quiet pride, not in vanquishing Karen's obsession, but in having navigated it without compromising principle, patience, or composure. It was a victory measured not in drama or spectacle, but in quiet reflection, in the unshakable stability of truth over ego, law over perception, and strategy over obsession. Finally, as the cabin lights dimmed and the snow-covered landscape was bathed in moonlight, I allowed myself a deep breath, one that carried away the tension of countless confrontations. The forest whispered softly in the wind, the lake shimmered with reflected starlight, and the cabin, my sanctuary, stood steadfast, a silent witness to the endurance of patience, clarity, and law. The saga, intense and prolonged as it had been, had concluded not with spectacle or vindictiveness, but with the serene triumph of reason, preparation, and unwavering principle. In the end, the lessons endured, that the human spirit can remain unshaken amidst relentless obsession, that clarity, patience, and law are shields stronger than intimidation, and that even in the most trying of conflicts, peace, reflection, and emotional strength are not only possible, they are inevitable when guided by truth and steadfast composure. The cabin, the forest, and the lake, silent yet ever present, bore witness to the journey. And as dawn broke over the hills, casting warm light across the snow, I felt a profound and lasting sense of closure, peace, and quiet triumph.